To you today, the learner,
Right.
we know you are constantly navigating this overwhelming sea of international news. You're trying to figure out how we actually got to where we are right now. So today's deep dive is designed specifically to cut through that noise.
Exactly.
We are giving you a thorough, highly engaging shortcut to being truly well-informed on one of the most complex, most talked about geopolitical relationships in the modern world, the United States and Iran.
It is a dynamic that completely dominates global headlines. Yet the underlying history, the actual root cause of all this tension, it's often completely misunderstood or just forgotten entirely.
Yeah, and to help us make sense of it all, we are pulling from a brilliant summary of the book America and Iran, A History 1720 to the Present by John Ghazvinian.
Yes, Ghazvinian's work.
Right, and what makes Ghazvinian's work so eye-opening is his background. He was born in Iran, raised in the United Kingdom, and holds a PhD in history from Oxford University. So he doesn't just hand us the standard Washington consensus.
No, not at all.
He actually puts us inside the minds of both sides, which it completely flips how you view some of the biggest events of the last century.
His research is incredibly meticulous. I mean, he pulls the lens way back to examine the foundational interactions between these two nations, long before the modern era of sanctions and proxy conflicts.
But before we jump in, we need to explicitly lay out the mission and the rules for this deep dive.
Yes, the impartiality rule.
Exactly. We are not going to take any political sides today. Our goal is to impartially report on the historical facts and the viewpoints exactly as they are presented in Ghazvinian's work. We're doing this simply to help you, the listener, understand the source material. No endorsements, just the history.
Just the history. And it is a fascinating history.
Okay, let's unpack this, because America and Iran did not start out as enemies. They actually started as mutual admirers.
They really did.
It is genuinely surprising to read about this honeymoon phase in the 18th and early 19th centuries. The newly independent United States looked at Persia, which is modern-day Iran, with absolute awe.
Total fascination.
Right. You had Americans in their parlors romanticizing Persian art and devouring translations of literature, like the poetry of Rumi and Hafez.
Yeah.
They were captivated by the ancient ruins of Persepolis. It was a fascination bordering on a cultural crush.
Well, you have to remember, you have this young, burgeoning American republic fresh off its fight for independence. They are trying to figure out their own identity.
Sure.
And they look across the globe to an empire with millennia of history, and they see something deeply aspirational. The first documented American to visit the Persian Empire was a man named John Ledyard in the late 18th century.
Right, Ledyard.
And his travels, along with early missionaries and businessmen, they laid the groundwork for a real spirit of exploration, which eventually culminated in the 1856 Treaty of Friendship and Commerce.
That treaty is such a monumental historical anchor.
It really is. It formalized diplomatic respect and a mutual willingness to engage as absolute sovereign equals.
I want you to imagine being a 19th century American reading the diplomatic reports from Samuel G. Benjamin. He was the first U.S. diplomat to actually reside in Iran.
Yes, Benjamin's accounts were incredible.
He was sending back these vivid, glowing accounts of Persian society. When you read those reports, you aren't seeing an ancient empire framed as a geopolitical threat. You are seeing a cultural marvel.
What's fascinating here is the story of Morgan Schuster, which really tests that early bond. It's such an incredible detail.
The Treasurer General, right?
Yes. In 1909, Iran actually appointed this American, Morgan Schuster, to be their Treasurer General. They trusted him to come in and reform their entire national finance system.
That is a massive amount of trust to place in a foreigner.
Exactly. And he was deeply respected by the Iranians for his absolute integrity, but his tenure ended abruptly. It was due to aggressive intervention from the British and the Russians.
The great powers.
Right. They did not want a strong, financially independent Iran on their borders, so they forced him out.
So if the Iranians brought Schuster in willingly, and then foreign powers forced him out, how did that impact the Iranian psyche?
It was a massive wake-up call. Schuster's forced departure planted the very first seeds of Iranian suspicion toward Western influence.
That makes total sense.
The underlying insight here is that this event taught Iran a harsh lesson. Playing by Western diplomatic rules and international law does not actually protect your sovereignty from great power politics.
Wow.
Yeah, that realization is the very beginning of a shift towards self-reliance and the asymmetric strategies we see Iran utilizing today.
That is a tragic contrast to the rhetoric we hear today. But then the 20th century arrives, and the world changes entirely. Here's where it gets really interesting, because the Cold War calculus enters the chat.
It certainly does.
Geopolitics basically hijacked the friendship. Suddenly, Iran isn't just a cultural marvel anymore. It is a vital piece on the global chessboard.
After World War II, the United States is locked in a global struggle against the Soviet Union, and Iran becomes incredibly strategic for two main reasons.
Location and resources.
Exactly. It shares a massive northern border with the Soviet Union, and it sits on an absolute ocean of oil wealth. U.S. policymakers looked at Iran and saw an essential pillar in the Middle East to contain Soviet expansion.
Wait, but in the 1950s, the United States was awash in its own domestic oil, especially out of Texas? Yeah. Why did Washington care so much about Iranian oil specifically?
It comes down to their closest ally, the British.
Of course.
The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which is the precursor to modern-day BP, controlled Iran's oil wealth and funneled the profits back to London.
Right.
When Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, decided to nationalize the oil industry in 1951, he simply wanted the wealth of Iran to benefit the people of Iran.
Which sounds completely reasonable for a sovereign nation.
To them, yes. But for the British economy, this was devastating. And Washington feared that a collapsing British economy, combined with a rogue, independent Iran, might push Mossadegh right into the arms of the Soviets.
The classic Cold War domino theory.
Exactly that. So in 1953, the CIA and British intelligence orchestrated a coup that ousted Prime Minister Mossadegh and reinstated the monarch, the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi.
That is such a massive turning point.
It really is. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the profound psychological impact this had on the Iranian populace cannot be overstated. It embedded a deep-seated generational resentment.
Because they had chosen their leader.
Yes. To millions of Iranians, this American intervention was a direct, unforgivable affront to their sovereignty and their own democratic aspirations.
And on a geopolitical level, the Shah plays his part perfectly for Washington. I mean, he aggressively modernizes the country and aligns tightly with the U.S.
Very tightly.
He even acts as a stabilizing pro-Western regional force during massive conflicts like the 1967 Six-Day War and the 1973 Yom Kippur War. From the outside, the alliance looks incredibly strong.
From Washington's perspective, it was a massive success.
But on the ground in Iran, it's like a glossy facade on a crumbling building. The Shah's authoritarian rule, his secret police, his extravagant lifestyle, and the rampant corruption in his government are completely alienating his own people.
You have a classic scenario of an autocratic leader deeply disconnected from his populace.
Yeah.
This brewing domestic storm provided the perfect opening for opposition groups. Religious leaders, most prominently Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, along with secular intellectuals and the working class, began to coalesce.
They all found a common enemy.
Exactly. They capitalized on this immense domestic suffering and successfully framed both the Shah and his American backers as the absolute root cause of Iran's societal woes. The anti-American sentiment evolved from a political grievance into a core ideology.
Which leads us directly to the seismic shift of 1979. It is hard to overstate just how huge this was. It sent pure shockwaves through the global community.
Nobody saw it coming quite like that.
Almost overnight, the Shah is forced to flee the country. Khomeini returns from exile in Paris to an electrified welcome in Tehran. The pro-Western monarchy, which the U.S. had relied on as a foundational pillar for decades, is instantly swept away.
And replaced by an Islamic republic deeply opposed to Western influence.
A total geopolitical earthquake. And it culminated in the event that permanently altered the modern relationship, the November 4th, 1979 hostage crisis.
Right. Iranian militants stormed and seized the U.S. embassy in Tehran, taking 52 Americans hostage. The standoff dragged on for an agonizing 444 days.
Reading the source material on this is fascinating because Ghazvinian forces us to look at this crisis through two completely incompatible realities colliding.
Yes, the two narratives.
It's almost like a messy Hollywood divorce where both sides are fighting over the exact same narrative but speaking different languages. To the United States, this was a terrifying, humiliating violation of the most basic international norms.
It was seen as sheer terrorism.
Right. An unprovoked attack on diplomats by a hostile, radical new regime. But the source asks us to look at the other side impartially.
Looking at the perspective of the Iranian revolutionaries, it was seen through an entirely different historical lens.
How so?
To them, seizing the embassy was a justifiable reclamation of their national sovereignty. They viewed the U.S. embassy not as a diplomatic sanctuary, but as a literal den of espionage that had orchestrated the 1953 coup.
Wow. So it all ties back to Mossadegh.
Absolutely. For the revolutionaries, holding those hostages was direct, tangible retaliation for decades of perceived American imperialism that had kept an autocratic Shah in power.
And the fallout from that single 444-day event was absolute.
It permanently severed formal diplomatic ties, but more than that, it poisoned public opinion on both sides for generations.
Yeah.
In the U.S., Iran became synonymous with radicalism and hostage-taking. In Iran, the U.S. was solidified as the Great Satan. That mutual trauma laid the groundwork for the incredibly messy decade that followed.
The 1980s. This is an era defined by containment, conflict, and staggering contradictions. It starts with Saddam Hussein's Iraq launching a full-scale invasion of Iran in 1980, kicking off the brutal Iran-Iraq War.
America's role in this war was highly convoluted.
That is an understatement.
Officially, the U.S. claimed neutrality, but strategically, Washington employed a policy of dual containment. The goal was to protect the flow of Persian Gulf oil and ensure that neither Iran nor Iraq emerged as a dominant regional superpower.
Keep them both in check.
Right. To achieve this, the U.S. provided significant intelligence and logistical support to Saddam Hussein's Iraq, while simultaneously imposing a strict international arms embargo on Iran, known as Operation Staunch.
It was akin to playing both sides of a chess game while blindfolded.
Exactly.
And that arms embargo leads us into a piece of history that is almost hard to wrap your head around, the Iran-Contra affair. I mean, it's almost absurd when you lay out the facts.
It really is.
While the U.S. government is publicly enforcing a global arms embargo against Iran, senior U.S. officials are secretly bypassing Congress to sell weapons directly to the Iranian government.
The motive behind that jaw-dropping contradiction was to secure the release of American hostages being held in Lebanon by Hezbollah.
Right, a totally different hostage situation.
Yes. Hezbollah is a militant group that shares Tehran's Shiite revolutionary ideology and operates as part of Iran's broader proxy network. Washington thought selling arms to Iran would get Tehran to pressure Hezbollah into releasing the captives.
And then, the profits from those secret arms sales were illegally funneled to fund the Contra rebels in Nicaragua, who were anti-communist insurgents fighting a Soviet-backed government in Central America.
It was incredibly convoluted. When this broke, it caused a massive political scandal, exposing incredibly deep fractures in American foreign policy.
But the 80s didn't just end with political scandals. It ended with an absolute tragedy in the Persian Gulf.
Yes. In 1988, in the waning days of the Iran-Iraq War, a U.S. Navy cruiser, the USS Vincennes, mistakenly shot down a commercial Iranian airliner, Iran Air Flight 655.
Just awful.
All 290 people on board, mostly Iranian civilians, were killed. The U.S. government stated it was a tragic misidentification, issued apologies, and eventually paid compensation.
But how did it play out in Iran?
For Iranians, this event was viewed as an act of profound, deliberate hostility. It deeply reinforced their fundamental distrust of the United States and starkly showcased the deadly real-world stakes of the ongoing American military presence in their backyard.
Layer upon layer of trauma and mistrust. But history doesn't stop. As we move into the 1990s and the early 2000s, the post-Cold War era, we actually see moments of hope.
We do.
Glimmers of a possible reconciliation. Though, as the text points out, it really turns into an era of massive missed opportunities.
The Clinton administration imposed harsh, comprehensive sanctions on Iran in 1995, but just 2 years later, things started to shift. President Clinton publicly acknowledged Iran's rich cultural contributions, extending a subtle olive branch.
Yeah, going back to that 19th century admiration almost.
Right. And more importantly, the Iranian people elected a reformist president, Mohammad Khatami.
Khatami was a totally different kind of leader for the Islamic Republic. He advocated for a dialogue among civilizations and actively wanted to reduce tensions with the West.
He was a moderate voice when they really needed one.
In 1998, he did something unprecedented. He gave an interview to CNN, bypassing official government channels to speak directly to the American people, calling for mutual understanding.
This raises an important question. If both sides were making these overtures, why did peace fail?
It's the multi-million-dollar question.
The answer lies in the domestic roadblocks within both nations. In Iran, Khatami's reformist agenda faced fierce, entrenched resistance from conservative hardliners who viewed any engagement with the West as an existential threat to the revolution.
Right, they couldn't let go of the great Satan narrative.
Exactly. Concurrently, in Washington, powerful lobbying groups and skeptical politicians remained deeply suspicious of Tehran's ultimate intentions. Neither side had the internal political capital to push a real peace deal across the finish line.
And then comes 9/11. There's a shocking detail in the book that most people don't know. Right after the September 11 attacks, Iran actually provided the United States with crucial intelligence to help fight the Taliban in Afghanistan.
They did.
There was a brief, highly pragmatic window of cooperation between Washington and Tehran.
A very real diplomatic opening. But it slammed shut just months later in 2002 when President George W. Bush delivered his State of the Union address.
The famous speech.
Yes. He famously lumped Iran in with North Korea and Iraq, labeling them an axis of evil.
I remember that vividly.
That single phrase instantly crushed the reformist momentum in Tehran. It completely vindicated the Iranian hardliners who had always argued that America could never be trusted.
Which brings us to arguably the biggest what-if of the modern era. The 2003 Grand Bargain. What exactly was on the table here?
A Swiss ambassador passed a comprehensive proposal from Tehran to Washington. It was an offer to negotiate everything.
Everything.
Everything. Iran was reportedly willing to discuss full transparency on its nuclear program, ending its support for militant groups like Hamas and Hezbollah, and even recognizing a two-state solution for Israel and Palestine.
That is massive.
In exchange, they wanted an end to U.S. sanctions and a halt to hostile rhetoric.
Why on earth would Washington ignore an offer that addresses almost every major grievance they have in the Middle East?
The timing was critical. This was 2003, right after the rapid U.S. invasion of Iraq.
Right.
The neoconservative wing in Washington, which held a very hawkish, aggressive foreign policy stance, felt they were absolutely winning the region. They believed the Iranian regime was weak and on the verge of collapse.
They thought they didn't need to make a deal.
Exactly. They didn't feel they needed to negotiate, so they dismissed the proposal entirely. It is viewed by many historians as a colossal missed opportunity to preempt decades of future conflict, particularly regarding Iran's nuclear ambitions.
So, what does this all mean? We've covered centuries of history, but the source leaves us with one ultimate, staggering historical irony regarding that very nuclear program.
Yes, this is a point that surprises almost everyone. Iran's controversial nuclear program, the very issue that causes so much modern anxiety, international sanctions, and covert warfare today, was actually kickstarted with direct United States support.
It's almost hard to believe.
In the 1950s, under the Eisenhower administration's Atoms for Peace initiative, the U.S. shared civilian nuclear technology with allied nations. The United States literally provided Iran with its first nuclear research reactor.
Wow.
They helped plant the very seeds for the program they are now desperately trying to contain.
That is incredible. A short-term strategy creating a massive, long-term, unintended consequence.
Exactly.
And that is exactly why we do these deep dives. We know that turning on the news today and hearing about the latest sanctions or rhetoric or regional proxy conflicts can feel incredibly overwhelming. It feels like this static, unsolvable problem.
But it has deep roots.
Right. But when you arm yourself with this history, when you know that we started with the 1856 Treaty of Friendship, when you understand the generational trauma of the 1953 coup, the ideological shift of the 1979 revolution, the bizarre mechanics of the Iran-Contra affair, and the heartbreak of the 2003 Grand Bargain, the headlines completely transform.
They take on a whole new context.
You realize that neither side's actions exist in a vacuum. They are reacting to a 250-year-old dance of mutual admiration, intense intervention, and very deep-seated historical memory.
That leaves us with a fascinating thought to mull over. We have seen just how deeply historical memory, specifically the lingering scars of 1953 and 1979, dictates the actions of current leaders in both Washington and Tehran.
Yeah.
But time doesn't stand still. Entirely new generations are coming of age in both America and Iran right now. These are generations whose only experience of the other is mediated through the internet and social media, rather than the lived trauma of the Cold War or the Islamic Revolution.
That's a great point.
So the question is, will the heavy weight of this shared painful history eventually fade with these new demographics, opening a path for a new dynamic? Or will the digital age simply invent new, faster ways to keep these old grievances alive and burning?
That is a phenomenal question to ponder. It really puts the future squarely in the hands of the next generation. We want to thank you, the listener, for taking the time to sit with us today and get well informed. Understanding the past is the only way to make sense of the present. Keep asking questions, keep looking for the bigger picture, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.